Okay, so we are with a break of 2 weeks. We need to do a little bit of a review, a little chazara. So we'll look back to Lamed Vav Amid Aleph. We actually turned the page, but let's go back to Lamed Vav Amid Aleph and refresh our recollection on the sugya. So we were getting into the question of whether or not if one shomer hands off an obligation of shmira to another shomer, whether or not that de-obligates, if that's the word, the first shomer, whether it puts the obligation on the second shomer. So what's the halacha here? What is the Gemara is really discussing a machlokas between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, and it's around the middle of Lamed Vav Amid Aleph. So I'm going to just review a little bit of it orally and then pick up from a little bit further down the daf. So there's a machlokes between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. Rav says, Shomer Shemasa l'Shomer Potter, that this is all about the first Shomer. The first Shomer is Potter because he's handed off the obligation to the second Shomer. And Rabbi Yochanan says, Chayiv, says no, that he does not remove his own obligation, whether or not the second shomer becomes obligated as well, but focusing on the first shomer, he's definitely still chayiv. And then the Gemara then goes on to explain why that is. And basically, according to Rav, the fact that the second shomer is a responsible adult is enough to take away the obligation from the first shomer. So Rav has a very, very lenient position. And he says, as long as you give it to someone who's responsible, is a bar chayuva, then that's enough. Comes Rabbi Yochanan and says, no. He says that's not a sufficient reason, and you're chayiv. Why? Because the owner of the pikadon can make the statement, Ein ritzoni sheyipikdoni biyad acher. I gave it to you because I trusted you, but I don't want you going around and giving it to other people that I don't know. So a sweeping statement of, I never dealt with the second person, I don't want to have anything to do with him, is enough, says Rabbi Yochanan, to make the first person chayiv, even if the second person is an example. The first person was a shomer chinam, and he gave it to the second person who was a shomer sachar with a higher degree of responsibility, who's also chayiv for geneva aveda, which the first one isn't. So you would think, oh, wow, I mean, he's getting a bargain here because he's getting a second shomer who is more responsible, for more things than the first. So the Rabbi doesn't matter. Even if you give it to someone with a greater degree of responsibility, the fact that the owner can say, I don't want my pikadon in someone else's hands, is enough to make him chayiv. So that's the outline of the machlokes between Rav, who's always lenient, and Rabbi Yochanan, who takes a much harder view and says that shomer shemasa l'shomer is chayiv. Okay, that's the background. Now we're going to pick it up from the beginning of the wide lines down at the bottom of the daf. So maybe 10 lines from the bottom, maybe.
Excuse me, Rabbi.
Gives us the following.
Excuse me.
Rav Ami, Rav Ami was learning, and he told us this the following shmaitza, the following event, the following story. Esve Rav Abba bar Mamel Rav Ami. Rav Abba bar Mamel asked Rav Ami a kasha, Hasocha para mechavero, which is basically our Mishnah. Hasocha para mechavero, someone who rents a para, a cow from his friend, v'hashila la'acher, and then he, in other words, Ruvain has a cow and he rents it to Shimon, and Shimon gives it to Levi to borrow. No monetary transaction. Umesa kedarka, and it dies a natural death, which is always potter. Yishava hasocher, the socher, the one who rented it from the first fellow, he swears, Shemesa Kedarka, he's no longer obligated because he's a socher, and Mesa Kedarka is an ones. Shoel, who is responsible for oines, right? The shoel who has no monetary obligation, but he has the greatest degree of responsibility. Shoel Mishalom l'socher, he has to pay to the socher. So this, and we discussed this already in the past. So the socher, in essence, is the one who's collecting the value of the animal, and the original owner, all he gets is just the schirus, the rental. And if we hold like Rabbi Yochanan, that what? That he is responsible. In other words, shomer shemosel shomer. The first shomer is always responsible. Who's the first shomer here? In essence, the socher, the one who rented it, right? He has a certain degree of shmira that a socher is responsible for. So in Isa, if you hold like Rabbi Yochanan, why do we exonerate the socher and say that he is not responsible because he can make a shvua? What kind of shvua? The owner says, that's Rabbi Yochanan's shita. Rabbi Yochanan says you're chayiv because I don't want you to give it to somebody else. I trust you, but I don't know from anybody else. So that's the kasha. Why is the Mishnah telling us that the socher is exonerated? According to Rabbi Yochanan, he should never be exonerated because that's the that's the kasha that Abba Bar Mamel.
Look in the dining room where the alcohol is.
Ask Rav Mamel.
I think I have them all piled up there.
Okay, so that's the shaila. Amalei. So the Gemara says, you know why? No, our Mishnah is the reason why we don't follow Rabbi Yochanan here. He says, Amalei hakavaya skinan b'shnoso lo reshus habalim lahashil. Okay, so we have the caveat that the owner gave the socher reshus, gave him permission to go ahead and rent it. So, or to lend it, so to speak. So in other words, we have not what we think is the case where there's no reshus, in which case it's a good kasha on Rabbi Yochanan. Why does the Mishnah say it's okay? It's not okay according to Rabbi Yochanan. There should be a caveat here. So, okay, so that's the answer. The answer is he gave him reshus. Freik the Gemara Yehacha lebalan boiler shlume. If he gave him reshus, then why does the socher swear and then he collects from the shoel? It should now go back to the original owner. He gave him permission. So that the money for the animal should now be paid to the original owner, not to the socher. If you're already introducing a new concept and saying he gave him reshus, then boiler shlume, he should pay to the original owner. But the Gemara, no, that it's kind of like a halfway thing. The omelei ledatoch. In other words, he gave him permission, but he gave him the flexibility to do it when he wants and what he wants. So the Gemara is telling us that if he does that, then not only does he give the socher permission to do what he wants to do, but he, the owner, is no longer in control because he's giving the socher full control to decide how and when to do it. Says the Gemara. So the Gemara is basically telling us that even though he gave him permission, the original owner still does not have bias. Why? Because he gave full flexibility to the socher, and therefore the socher is really the Baal here, and therefore the Mishnah is correct when it says the socher can swear, as long as he swears it's not in my possession, which we know is a shvua you always have to make. You have to make a shvua that I myself didn't convert it. But once he makes that shvua, he's in total control, and therefore if the animal dies and the shoel is chayiv for oines, the shoel has to pay to the socher, and the original owner is out of the picture. So that helps explain the Mishnah, A, why we don't bring in Rabbi Yochanan and say chayiv, because he gave him permission, and B, because he gave him permission and he gave him the flexibility to do what he wants when he wants, he's no longer the balabas. Okay, so that's the explanation for the Mishnah, and we'll see how. The reason I'm reviewing it is because it's important later on when we discuss the Gemara. We'll come back to this. But Lamaisa, we now see that our Mishnah, which of course is the correct Mishnah, tells us that the Socher is the one who gets the money from the Shoel. And the reason why the owner doesn't get it is because he's not in control and he gave him that flexibility. Okay, so that's that discussion. Now, the Gemara goes weiter.
Excuse me,
Go ahead.
do we have an element of trust here? Or why don't we use trust to simplify this? If A, borrows it and he rents it to B, he certainly can say, I trust B. That should not be any difference since I was trusted by the owner. So I'm missing like this notion of, are we setting a precedence here related to trust?
Well, again, Rabbi Yochanan, the reason why Rabbi Yochanan says that Shomer Salmashal the Shomer is chayiv is because the contact between parties is important for us to understand. In other words, he takes the view, obviously opposed to Rav. Rav is very simple. You're always trusted. You're always able to give it to somebody else as long as that person is a responsible person. He's not a loose cannon. Rabbi Yochanan says, and this is not uncommon in the Gemara, is that when two people transact, they transact because there is a connection between the two people. I know you, you know me, I have a good feeling about you, therefore I will rent to you. I'm not going to rent to Yitzchak because I don't trust him. He's a wild guy. So your notion of trust it's very much on the table, is that when two people transact, the reason why they're transacting is because there is something about the relationship that lets the lender, so to speak, the owner say, you know what, especially now, you think about it in terms of COVID, let's say. Today, we deal with COVID, we deal with people who shirk their responsibilities, they don't pay their rent, they don't do this, they don't do that. So we deal in a world today where there is much more hefkeris, not because someone wants to, but because he can't afford. So if one person says, I trust you, therefore, even though you're paying me rent, but I trust you, you're going to go ahead and you're going to deal with someone that I don't know, maybe that person is not trustworthy. So in other words, the whole notion of trust, Jay, is the underpinning, the underlying reason why the transaction is even going forward.
Okay,
Says Rabbi Yochanan, as a result of that, I, who own the Pikadon and rent, even though I rented, I'm making money on you, but I'm doing so knowing that you're a responsible person and that you will pay me. But if you're giving it to a third person, how do I know who that person is?
Doesn't this go beyond that? I mean, don't we, it's implicit, isn't it, that when the owner gives the guy gives the socher reshus to lend it out to a third party, isn't he implicitly saying that I think you have the seichel to know that the third party is a bar chiyuv and is going to be okay? I have trust, that it would go that far. I would think maybe.
Right. And Rabbi Yochanan is basically saying, no, I trusted you, specifically you, because I know you, but I don't trust you enough that you should use your own independent seichel to give it to somebody else. So that's far. I don't trust you.
Okay. So he only believes one generation of trust.
That's right. That's right. He believes.
Generation.
Right. In other words, I know you, therefore I have a comfort with you, but I don't have a comfort that you're not going to give it to someone else that I might not like. That much leeway I don't give you. So Rabbi Yochanan is very stringent here. And that's why he says there's always a chiyuv by shomer, shemasal shomer, is because this whole notion of shmira, of connectivity, doesn't go beyond you and me.
So maybe a modern example is a car. if I lend you my car, that's because I trust that I think you're a reasonable driver, you'll take care of it and so on. I'm not expecting that you would turn around and loan it to, some 16-year-old who's got his license. And alternatively, where we have, if you rent a car and there you're actually paying money and you have responsibility, they go ahead and make sure you have insurance. And if they think and then on top of that, if they don't think your insurance is good enough, or if you're not sure, they make you buy additional insurance on top of it. And you're every which way saying that you will not let anybody who's not already on the list drive this car. So we had they treated cows the same way to some degree.
Right, and that's exactly the basis of the machlokes, because according to Rav, as long as the person he's minimally qualified, let's just say he's a bardas, he's bar mitzvah, he doesn't have to have any specific qualifications. That alone makes the transaction valid. Rav is very lenient. But Yochanan comes and says, no, we're not going to go that route. We're going to say that the transaction is between two people and two people only. Therefore, even though I trust you, that trust goes between me and you, but not between you and anybody else. And that's exactly the point that you're making, Menashe, and Jay, to your point. Trust only goes so far. It only goes as far as my relationship to you.
So why does Rav stop at 2 generations are okay? What about 3, 4, and 5 generations?
Again, so that's the basis of the machlokes, is that Rav says we're not worried about generations of trust as long as the person is a bardas. We're going to give him every benefit of the doubt. Maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we should give people the benefit of so much leeway, but that's the basis of the machlokes between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. Rav says as long as he's the bardas and we can qualify him as being a person of seichel, we're not going to go beyond that and say, he doesn't have this qualification or that qualification. But Rabbi Yochanan can be very, very meticulous and says, as long as I know who it is, that's fine. But I don't give reshus beyond it. So that's in essence the machlokes between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan.
Excuse me, one thing, Rabbi. David is here now, and I know he typically has mishaberach to say.
All right, so before we go to Masa, you want to give the mishaberach, or we'll go in, we can do it later, whatever you like.
You're muted, David.
It's your call. Do you want me to interrupt you, or do you want to?
Well, if you want to do it now, because we're gonna start this new part,
Okay.
we can do it right now.
Reuben Yehuda Ben Zisa.
Reuben Yehuda Ben
Atara
Zisa.
Basrachel- I'm sorry. Atara Basrachel Yehudis.
Atara Basrachel Yehudis.
Raphael Hirsch Ben Egel.
Raphael Hirsch Ben Edel.
Golda Basrivka.
Golda Basrivka.
Shmuel Avram Ben Yehudis.
Shmuel Avram Ben
Yehudis.
Yehudis.
Tzvi Ben Leah.
Tzvi Ben Leah.
Maryash Mata Bas Risha Miriam.
Marish Mata Bas Risha Miriam.
Chava Naomi Bat Devorah Chana.
Naomi Bas Devorah Chana.
Chaviva Yael Basara.
Chaviva Yael Basara.
Rav Shlomo Ben Basya.
Rav Shlomo Ben Basya.
Alexandra Rachel Bas Miriam Aliza.
Alexandra Rachel Ben Miriam Aliza.
Leah Esther Bas Rivka.
Leah Esther Bas Rivka.
Moshe Yehuda Menachem Ben Chava.
Moshe Yehuda Menachem Ben Chava.
Rachel Bat Miriam.
Rachel Bat Miriam.
Harav Baruch Shmuel HaKohen Ben Leah.
Baruch Shmuel HaKohen Ben Leah.
Rav Avram Ben Chana.
Avram Chana.
And Miriam Esther Bas Noni.
Miriam Esther Bas Naomi?
Noni.
Noi.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
Before you move on the subject of connectivity, I think there's an interesting lesson that maybe comes from the parsha on the Shomrim, where the borrower is liable for everything, as you taught us, except when the real owner is with them. And I think the rabbis interpret that as an employment relationship. But I think it reflects something that everybody knew everybody in the typical situation, especially as Rav viewed it. They all knew each other. And as far as the situation about whether you're trusting somebody or whether you would lend something to somebody or whether you even rent it out to somebody, it was all because it was a tight society where they all knew each other, the connectivity aspect.
Right. No, there's no question that there was a lot of that played into it as well. So, and today, of course, it's not that way at all because you barely know the next person.
Well,
So-
along those lines, I'd say also is I think we've had at times in the Gemara issues. Well, if you have somebody who came from a different town, but our town here, even just Camp Mill, is bigger than is bigger than a lot of communities, entire shtetls, and so on, and it's
Right.
or in Bavel, etc. So it's
Right.
different, an order of magnitude different.
Right, absolutely, and therefore Rabbi Yochanan, we can understand that even in a smaller setting, he's more makbid. He says, this is a pekadon, this is something I value, and I don't give everybody the same equal trust. So that's why he's much more stringent. But you're correct. I mean, timing, of course, was different in those days as well. But again, this is it's a living Torah, so we have to adapt to today. And today we clearly understand that, and especially given the current circumstances that we're in our own matzav, I want to safeguard my possession. I don't want my possession just out there because there's too many people who will abuse it and not pay and this, that, and the other. And I don't want to be in a position where I have to start hounding people and collecting from people. Therefore, I give it to you, I trust you, but it ends with you. Anything you do that is beyond what we agreed upon is your responsibility, but I trust you. So I know that you'll make good, but I don't trust somebody else who I don't know. So yeah, that's very much an important understanding as well, for sure. Okay, so let's now continue. So 4 lines from the bottom. Moshev Rami Bar Chama. So Rami Bar Chama asked the following. So now we're going to get really into a very important question of whether or not a person, following up on this machlekes between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, is what a person's expectations are when he gives someone a pikadon. So hamafkid mos eitel chaveiro, if someone gives money for safekeeping to eitel chaveiro, now tzrorin. So the shomer, so to speak, he bundles it, or he swings it over his back. In other words, he's a little bit careless with it, but nevertheless, it's under his control. Masrun levno v'bito hakatanim, or he gives it to his son or daughter who is a cotton, so he's not a bar chiyuva. V'noel b'fneihem shelo karoi, and there's different interpretations of what this means, but basically he doesn't lock the door. In other words, he's not careful that it should be under complete lock and key. Chayiv. Why? Shelo shoma kederech hashomer. Because he's chayiv in these circumstances, because it shows a certain carelessness, and he doesn't guard it the way a shomer should guard it. So in other words, whatever the standard was, he played a little fast and loose, and therefore, in that case, even though he is, you would say, typically he's a shomer chinam and he should not be responsible, but we're saying that there's an element of pshia because a shomer chinam is responsible for carelessness, that he's careless, and therefore he didn't meet the minimum standard. So even as a shomer chinam, he is chayiv. Okay, that's the statement. Now, says the Gemara, Tamam ikatanim. It seems from this Gemara, from this statement, that the reason why he's responsible and he didn't do it Kederach HaShomrim, is because he entrusted it to a cotton, and not a bar chayuva. Or gedolim potter. What if he had entrusted, same circumstance, but he had entrusted it to a gadol, meaning a bar chayuva, then he would be okay, because that's legitimate. Like the Gemara Mai. Name Malay ein ritzona shebekdona biyad acher. In other words, now Rabbi Yochanan, we understand Rabbi Yochanan is very, very stringent. So Rav, okay, as long as the person is a bar chayuva, fine. He's a bar mitzvah boy, he's whatever he is. Rav is very lenient. But Rabbi Yochanan, we just said, ein ritzona shebekdona biyad acher. So he didn't give rishus for it to go beyond the actual shomer to his children or to anybody else. So why do we say, we infer that the reason why he didn't do it Kederach HaShomrim because it was a cotton, but if it was a gadol, it would be okay. According to Rabbi Yochanan, why is it okay? It shouldn't be okay, because he didn't entrust it to someone beyond just the individual who he gave it to. And that's the kasha of the Gemara. Mosif. That's the kasha. You're saying it's okay. Why is it okay? So that's the kasha. Omar Rava. So Rava will explain and tell us. Kol hamafkid. Now we're on Lamed Bava Metzia. Kol hamafkid. Al das ishtu mavanav hu mafkid. So he makes a generic statement that when a person gives someone, an individual, a obligation, in this case to be Ishamar Chinam, to guard his objects, inherently he's including in that Shmira Ishto Ubanav, meaning that if you will give it to me, to my possession, to my rishus, then my wife and my children are considered part of my rishus, and therefore if I gave it to my wife as a substitute or to my adult children to watch, then that's okay, even according to Rabbi Yochanan. That's Rava's interpretation. Rava is saying that you can't exclude from Shmira those who are under the roof, under your roof, because basically your roof includes everybody who would be normally part of your family. So Rava is now opening up, and he's saying, and we'll take a look at the Rashi on Lamed Vav Metzia, the top Rashi. He says, Al da shehanifked mosra leishtu rabbanon hagedolim ve'nichol nome ein ritzonenu. In other words, Rabbi Yochanan's view of ein ritzoni she'epikdona b'yad acher does not include a wife and children under the same roof of the person who he is giving the pikadon. So that's already a chiddush that Rava is expanding the interpretation of Rabbi Yochanan, that Rabbi Yochanan means when he says ein ritzoni, it means outside of the immediate family who live under the same roof. Okay, so that's Rava's interpretation, and Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan won't dispute it. Omer nardoi. So and the proof of this, says Nardoi, dekenami diktoni. It's a proof that this is what Rabbi Yochanan means. Because we say that if he gives it to his son or daughter who's a cotton, is chayiv. Olive no, lebita hagdolim, potter. But we infer that if he gave it to his son or daughter, a gadol who's under his roof, potter. Meklal, says the Gemara, Mechlal v'la'acherim, for someone other than his family, loshno gdolim, loshno tanim chayiv. In other words, the limitation of giving it to his family is only limited to those under his roof, and a cotton is not acceptable. A gadol is acceptable. But what about a gadol outside of the family? Let's say a gadol, a bar chiyuva, who is not under the roof of the shomer. So says the Gemara, Miklal v'la'acherim loshno gdolim loshno ketanim chayiv. You're always chayiv even for a gadol. In kain listen ketanim stama, because if in fact you were allowed to give it to a gadol outside of the family, let the Gemara just simply say, you can't give it to a katan, regardless of whether he's in the family or not in the family. And we'll understand that every gadol is okay. Says the Gemara, Shema Mina, therefore Nardoi is learning out that from the fact that we don't say that, we don't say that a katan is not acceptable, but every gadol is acceptable. So therefore, it's proof positive that only a gadol under the roof is acceptable, but a gadol outside of the roof, meaning any other person, is not acceptable. And therefore, Rabbi Yochanan says, which is his shita, that you can't give it shomer masal shomer, even if he's a baal, which again, Rab says that as long as he's a baal das, it's okay. Rabbi Yochanan disputes that and says, no, a baal das means a gadol, essentially. That's what we're talking about. So Rabbi Yochanan says, no, a baal das is not a valid criterion, that it has to be a gadol under the roof, but a gadol outside of the roof, meaning anybody else, is not acceptable. So that's how the Gemara comes out, and the Gemara wants to give this explanation to tell us that Rabbi Yochanan again makes that chilik between someone who is I trust and someone who I don't know. He could be a very fine person, but I don't know him. Therefore, even if he's a gadol, I don't accept it. Okay, so this is the little caveat that Rava is throwing in, is that Rabbi Yochanan would admit that in a case of under the roof, meaning your family, that a gadol is acceptable, even though it's not the person you gave it to. But Rabbi Yochanan would agree, and Adoi brings Varaya that Rabbi Yochanan would agree. Okay, Amar Rava, Hilchaser Shomer Shemosel Shomer Chayiv. The halacha is, again, at the time, this is what Rava is documenting, that Shomer Shemosel Shomer is Chayiv, like Rabbi Yochanan's position. Lo Maboy Shomer Sachar Shemosel Shomer Chinam de Grue Gara Lishmirasa. And again, this is what we said in the beginning. If you were a Shomer Sachar and you gave it to a Shomer Chinam, so you were lowering the standard, you're making it less attractive to the owner because now he has to deal with a Shomer Chinam, not a Shomer Sachar. Of course, in that case, Rabbi Yochanan would say no. Ela afilu Shomer Chinam shemasel Shomer Sachar, even a Shomer Chinam who gives it to a Shomer Sachar, chayiv. He is chayiv. Why should he be chayiv? He's giving it to a better, higher standard of shmira on behalf of the owner. My tama, the amalei at mahamatli b'shvua, heich lo mehemenli b'shvua. So this is an offshoot of what we just said before, that he doesn't trust somebody else, is because I believe you with a shvua, but I don't believe someone else with a shvua. In other words, we use the term now we're using a slightly different terminology. We're saying the same thing. We're saying that when it comes to a shvua of a shomer, I believe you because I have this connectivity to you, but I don't believe someone else who's going to make a shvua, even though he makes a shvua, which is a very powerful thing. Still, that's not something that the owner, want to get into, because I trust you and I don't trust the the fellow. Says Rashi, Deka Nami, the high the Gedolim Peturim Dafka Bonav Noket Velo Acherim. That was the Nadoi's proof that when it says Gedolim, it only means Gedolim under the roof, not anybody else. The Imkain de la Acherim Nami Gedolim Potter, listener Oshamosul Ktanim Stama. Right. So that's what we said. In other words, that was the proof. B'shvua shalom pasha. Remember that the basic shvua that the shomer has to make is that he was not careless with it. That's a shvua that he always has to make. And since that's a standard shvua, you might think that shvua should be acceptable regardless of who the shomer is. Comes Rabbi Yochanan and tells us no, that even though it's a forced shvua, you have to make that shvua. It's not optional. I don't trust. So again, back to our discussion before about whether or not it's the right thing or not the right thing, because you're dealing with someone that you don't know. The owner has at least as much credibility to say, I want to be the balabas of my chayfetz, and therefore, when I lend it out, or when I give it as a pekadon, or whatever the case may be, it's only to someone that I select, not someone that randomly comes into the picture through a third person. And that again, that's the subject of trust, which we see that Rav is much more trusting, and Rabbi Yochanan takes the position, no, I'm not so trusting, that I'll give it to anybody who comes along, because I trust you, I'll trust your judgment. Terrace is, I trust you, but I don't trust your judgment. In other words, you and I have a connectivity, but when it comes to you making decisions for me, not so fast, not so fast. So, and again, that's human nature. We're talking about human nature, that people just don't necessarily trust. They give latitude to someone up to a point, but they don't say that I give you more latitude to do what you individually want to do without my rishus. Okay. Okay, so that now is kind of ends this portion of the sugya, to say that according to Rava, Rabbi Yochanan is really the standard, and therefore we are very stringent about what we do as far as giving someone permission. So, and Rashi goes on and says, "Heich lo mehemenli, va'ani omer sheyeshna biyado o she'achla o posha bo." So, in other words, to me, he's basically saying that I can't trust that someone else won't be careless with my chayfetz. Therefore, I don't give that latitude again, according to Rabbi Yochanan. So, okay, again, so now we're going to transition. We're going to continue, but we're going to transition to a different aspect of this discussion.
Excuse me, Rabbi.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just curious about it, because we have the situation of trust. Why can't a girl below age tell her father, I don't trust you that you want me to marry this other guy? Why doesn't it work there?
Well, but in essence, it does work, because once she becomes a Gedola, she can renounce. So in other words, we take the position that a cotton is lav bar seichel. Okay, for better or for worse, a cotton doesn't have the seichel, the independent knowledge or character to make decisions. And therefore, we say that it's the responsibility of the parent, in this case, the father, to make decisions on behalf of his young child, his young daughter. So, and again, Chazal, in their wisdom, made this decision. We can argue it's a valid decision, it's not a valid decision, but the Chazal say that a cotton is lav bar das. Okay, some ketanim have more das than a gadol, but okay, as a general matter. But interesting, because you bring this up, when it comes to marrying off a ketana, then the girl does not have a say, but once she becomes a gedola, then she can retroactively have a say. So in other words, we're not sort of sweeping it entirely under the rug and saying, you're out of luck, because we say that a young girl doesn't have, she's under the rishus of her parents, but when she becomes a gedola, we allow her to make some decisions, even if the father had already made decisions on her behalf. So you see that the Chazal again did give some latitude to her once she became a gedola. What's magical about the age? That's always a discussion that has come up. What's magical about 12 versus 12 in a day? Okay, it's not something we're going to get.
If the father really marries her off to somebody and she wants to back out of it,
it becomes complicated. It becomes very complicated.
She can't marry a Kohen. And
right.
all along she says, I don't want to marry this guy.
Right. No, it becomes very, very complicated. I agree. It's not a simple solution, just to say that you can
It's not,
retroactively.
yeah, but I think my take on it is that there is, even though, yes, we don't always trust people in general, the idea of father knows best, the idea that your parents should in most circumstances be looking out for your best interests.
That's right. That's obviously the general concept is that a father would not do something to harm his own child. But when it comes to things like marriage, that becomes very sticky and very complicated because the father may have a I don't know, vested interest or a different view, and that becomes something that is a little bit more complicated. We're not going to get into it here, but in that sugya becomes a very interesting sugya in Kedushin, and another where is how you deal with that. Okay, now, so now we're at the two dots, and here the Gemara is going to take off on this whole issue and go a little bit further. Itmar, we learned as follows: Hoshaba v'yotzes la'agam. A person entrusted, let's say, his animal with a shomer chinam, and the shomer chinam is now watching the animal. Hoshaba, he was careless. Carelessness is not a teretz for shomer chinam. The yotzes la'agam, and it went into the swamp. Okay, so we're going to in a minute we're going to explain what the agam really means here. And umesa kedarka, and it went to the swamp, and it died a natural death, which is not a chiyuv for a shomer chinam. So we have a couple of things going on here. He was careless. He didn't watch the animal as he should, and a shomer chinam is responsible for pshia. But it went out and then died a natural death, for which the shomer chinam has no responsibility. So Rashi says, he didn't lock the door. Now here says Rashi, in other words, what's the definition? Why using the word agam? Agam is a swamp. It's a place where there is no shmira etzel ze'evim for wolves, below etzel ganavim. In other words, it's an open area, and the animal can be attacked by another animal, by a wolf, or someone can steal the animal. But in point of fact, nothing happened. A wolf didn't eat him, and it wasn't stolen. Umesa, and it died. It started off with carelessness. Maybe something bad will happen. But at the end, that pshia was immaterial. So we have an anomaly here where it starts with a pshia, which clearly is a chiyuv for a shomer chinam, but at the end, it had nothing to do with pshia. It didn't die. The animal wasn't kidnapped or eaten by a wolf, which clearly would have been the responsibility of the shomer chinam. It died a natural death. So now we have to wrestle with what takes precedent, the pshia or the oinus. That's what this Gemara is about.
Maybe get back to the car idea. You got some guy and he's speeding along, he's running red lights and everything, but in the end, the car doesn't get hit until it's parked and sitting in the lot.
That's right. Right. So we have to extrapolate here and understand which of these two different polar opposites is really at play here. Is it the pshia, for which he is chayiv, but nothing happened? Or is it the oinus, because at the end it died a natural death? Now, okay, you're being passive because you're not asking the real question here is, would it have died a natural death if it was not in the agam? That's going to be something we're going to delve into, because one could argue, sure, it died a natural death, but it wouldn't have died a natural death if it had been under lock and key. We don't know that, but that's really inherently what the shaila is did something happen here, even though that didn't trigger the death, but it triggered the steps leading to the death. So that's really a shaila here. So now there's a machlokes, as there always is. Abaya mishmei de Rabba. So now Rabba was the Rebbe, and Abaya and Rava were learning pshat in Rabba. Abaya mishmei de Rabba Omar Chayiv. Abaya in the name of Rabba says Chayiv, meaning what? That tchilasa the pshia, the seifer ba'oines, we follow the pshia. Rava mishmei de Rabba Omar. Rava, on the other hand, says in the name of his teacher Rabba, Potter, that he Potter, because we don't look to the pshia, we look to the end result, and the end result was an oines. Says the Gemara, Abaya mishmei de Rabba Omar Chayiv. Abaya in the name of Rabba says Chayiv, and this is a remark which is very interesting because it works both ways. Kol daina de lo doin ki hai daina lav dainahu. So in other words, Abaya says, if there is a dayan who doesn't follow my view, he's not a legitimate dayan. In other words, my view is so strong that if you don't follow it, you're not even. It's a throwaway. But it just, the Gemara is telling us that's how strongly Abaya and Rava, for that matter, feel about their view. Is that they say if you don't follow me, you're not a legitimate dayan. So lo says Abaya, lo maboya l'man amet tchilasa b'pshia v'sofa b'onas chayiv b'chayiv. There's no question that, according to the man d'Omer who says tchilasa b'pshia v'sofa b'onas is chayiv, that you're chayiv in this case, according to Abaya. Ela afilu l'man d'Omer Potter, says Abaya, even according to the man d'Omer who says tchilasa b'pshia v'sofa b'onas is Potter, hacha chayiv. In our case, you're chayiv. My tama de omrinan havla de agma kotla. So in other words, Abaya is telling us the following. You know what? There's no question that you're chayiv here. But even someone who would say the tchilasa b'pshia, the sofa ba'ones, we go with the ones. Here we can't go with the ones. Why? Because the fact that, what was the pshia? The pshia is that you didn't lock the door, and you let it run into the swamp. He's saying, havla the agma kotla. The air, the atmosphere of the agam was so negative that it caused the death, even though it looks like a natural death. So Abaya is taking a very stringent view, and he's saying that even though what appears to be a natural death wouldn't be natural if you hadn't allowed it to run into the agam. That's Abaya's view. Now, Rava Mishmei.
We don't yet know the proximate cause of death of the animal. I mean, it could have, we don't know yet. I mean, he's just theorizing.
Right. All we've done here, there's no autopsy, there's nothing. The animal just dropped dead.
Right.
So it clearly wasn't eaten by a wolf. It clearly wasn't stolen, which is the result of what the pshia would be. Because if you're careless, the carelessness that we worry about is that a wolf will eat it or it'll be stolen.
Right.
Those two things didn't happen. So can you, in one sense, negate the pshia and say, okay, no more pshia, because the pshia didn't happen. Now, anything that follows that is not a pshia anymore. Says Abaya, you can't do that because, and that's why I raised the question before, is the fact that the pshia led to its running into the swamp to die a natural death. According to Abaya, that's not legitimate. You can't say that the pshia was vitiated totally, and now we're dealing with an ones, because it would, according to Abaya, it would have never have happened if you hadn't allowed it into the agam in the first place. You know, the agam is such a terrible thing, the swamp is such a terrible thing, that going there hastened the animal's quote unquote natural death. So therefore, when the whole question comes up, you really got to wrestle with it. So which is it? Is it pshia or is it ones? Says Abaya, it's definitely pshia, because if you hadn't allowed it to run out, it never would have died. We don't know that, by the way. I mean, we're speculating, but we're saying that we have enough of a credibility to say that your pshia led to the ones, and therefore it's lots of pshia. The sofa bonus chayiv, according to Abaya.
It could have been spooked. Rabbi, it could have been spooked and it died of a heart attack.
Right, but again, now we're playing kind of fast and loose. What was the reason for the ones? What was the reason for it dying, just dropping dead? Is it truly because it had a heart attack and would have had a heart attack in the house or outside? Or, as Abaya says, no, we're going to, since we don't know, we're going to take a stringent view here. And we're going to say that, you know what? You were the contributor to the heart attack. We don't know that, but the fact that it was in the agam, which is a nasty place, right? It's like saying, I got a cold, and as a result of the cold, the cold led to terrible things. Well, why did you get the cold? Well, I got the cold because I was in the swamp. Okay, if I had been under lock and key in the house, I wouldn't have gotten the cold. So again, this is Abaya Lishitasa, that Abaya is being very stringent, and he's saying that the fact that it started with the Pshia is enough to say that even if there was an onus later on, the Pshia prevails and you're a chayiv. So that's Abaya Shita. Now comes Rava, Mishmei de Rava, Potter. And he too says the same thing. Kol daina l'adon ki adina lav dainahu. He makes the same statement. If you don't hold like me, you're not a dayan. So each one holds, my view is the stronger view. So says Rava, Lo maboy l'manda metilas b'pshia v'safel on his potter. There's no question that if you hold tchilas b'pshia v'safel on his potter, the potter, that you're potter in this particular case. Ela afil l'manda omar, says Rava, even according to the manda who says chayiv, that tchilas b'pshia v'safel on his chayiv, hacha potter. In our case, it's so overwhelming that you're potter. So listen to this. My tama, the amrinan malachavavis mali haka mali hosam. Because when it comes to death, the malachavavis isn't discriminating. He says, what's the difference if I kill him in the swamp or I kill him in the house? The malachavavis, the malachavavis comes and he kills him. So in other words, Rava is taking a whole different view of this whole thing. He's saying death is death. We're not going to legislate what was the cause of the death, because the malachamavis ultimately, I mean, kaviyachol, as we, the Banishon is saying, malachamavis, you do your thing. So the malachamavis goes out and he does his thing. Does he care whether the animal is in the swamp or whether the animal is safely in the barn? It doesn't matter. Says Rava that since the malachamavis is the one who makes the decision on the death of the animal, it truly is an ones, because it has nothing to do with where the animal is. It has to do with whether or not its time is up. And according to Rava, his shita is that it's the malachamavis who makes the decision. It's given license to make that decision. And therefore, you can't say it was because of the agam. Abai, on the other hand, says that since we don't know, and all we do know is that there was a pshia and it went to the agam, and the agam is not a good place. So that's the essence of the machlekes between Abai and Rava, is whether or not you're subjective or objective. If you're subjective, like Abaya is, then you say, you know what, this wouldn't have happened if the animal was under lock and key. But if you're objective, as the way Rava is, Rava says, what difference does it make? The animal's time was up. The malachamavis came and killed him. He could have killed him just as well and put it in safely in the barn. So in other words, we're trying to understand the underlying machlekes between Abai and Rava, and the Gemara is telling us that it has to do with whether or not it's outside of your control or not. According to Abai, it's not outside of your control. Therefore, even though it died what looks like a natural death, Pshia is still the underlying cause. And according to Rava, it's totally not in your control. You're not in control of life and death, right? That the Rebbeinu Shalom gives the Malach HaMavis that license, and he decides, the Malach HaMavis says, okay, it's time for this animal to die.
I got a little bit of a problem here with the Gemara here. This idea of taking the Malach HaMavis concept, which we normally apply, or I, in my experience, always thought that's something we apply to people. And so we say, okay, if somebody gets killed in an accident or somebody gets killed in a war, it's all in a sense the Malach HaMavis that this was
Right.
their time was up and this is how they went. Do we really apply the same thing to animals? The animals which we slaughter for food and everything else? I mean, it's
Well, but
bizarre.
Okay, in essence, I understand your question, but Rava is saying that life and death, regardless of whether it's a human or an animal, life and death is not in our control. And therefore, since it's not in our control, you can't impute a particular position to say, but for this animal wouldn't have died. Or
But in that
for-
case, I shouldn't have any responsibility to worry about the animal's life at all. I could just let it wander. I could let it do whatever. I may be responsible for it tripping and falling and getting injured, but for dying, I wouldn't be responsible.
Well, and in essence, Rava is saying that what is a natural death, what looks like natural death, you're right, is not in our control. Natural death is something that it's in the province of the Ribono Shel Olam, and so he gives the Malach HaMavis that rishus to make that decision.
But
I understand.
you still have to look when you cross the street because of, I mean, that's exactly what Menashe is saying.
Right.
How can we believe both sides of this? I mean, it's either one or the other. It can't be both.
Right. Well, okay. So it does raise some complications, but in essence, just like the machlokes of Rav and Rabbi Yochanan has to do with when you boil it down to its real core, it has to do with simplicity. I trust someone. I don't trust someone. I say that a person is a Baal Seichel, then he's a Baal Seichel. I'm not going to legislate how much Seichel he has, if he's 13 or 14 or 18. So to Abaye and Rava, when you break it down to its real core, you have a situation where you have competing interests, Shia on the one hand, Oinus on the other hand. Our responsibility is to figure out which carries the greater weight, the Pshia or the Oinus. Now that's a tough question. How do I know if the Pshia was the real cause or the Oinus was the real cause? Comes Abaye and says, to me, once something starts with Pshia, you're in trouble. Because even though it ends in Oinus, the Pshia is what kicked off the event. Now you could argue and say, but wait a minute, at some point in time, it crossed over from Pshia into Oinus. And that's the discussion. Rava says, you're right, Pshia started it off. But at some point, we're beyond Pshia. We don't say that once you're Pshia, you're forever careless. You can end that Pshia, and we'll see the Gemara will talk about that. But so, in other words, you have to have an open mind here. And you have to say, yes, there was a Pshia, but the Pshia ended. And once it ended, and this animal died, it didn't die from the carelessness. The carelessness ended already. Abaye says, no, it didn't. It didn't end because, specifically here, because of the Agam, we can understand why he says it, is because bad air is bad air. If the animal was exposed to bad air, even though from every objective means it looks like it died the way any animal might have died in the barn, but the fact that it was kicked off by Pshia, Abaye says, is enough to allow the Pshia to control. That's Abaye Shita. Rava, on the other hand, says, wait a minute, I get it. Pshia is a bad thing, and Hashem Mechinim is chayiv for Pshia, but we're not going to make him chayiv forever for Pshia when we can sort of naturally say the Pshia ended. Nothing happened as a result of the Pshia. A wolf didn't eat it, a ganef didn't steal it. You can't hold him liable forever just because of the Pshia. Says Rava, the Pshia ended, life went on, and all of a sudden the animal died. Now, we can argue here whether or not the Malach HaMavis has better things to do than to go after an animal, this, that, and the other. But when you think of it, al pi seichel is an animal dies every day. An animal dies in the barn. An animal dies walking along the road. An animal dies because it has too much burden on its back. You can look at all the different ways that an animal might die, but at some point you have to say, honest, it was an accident. The Malach HaMavis decided this animal is going to die here today, not because of an illness, not because of a burden, simply because its time was up. Now, again, we're being very simplistic, but the fact of the matter remains is that when you weigh the two sides, you have to weigh carefully what really is the overwhelming cause of death.
So the dispute is really over whether things are independent or they're related. There's some connection between the first phase and the second phase.
Right, but how are you and I going to determine that? I mean, how are we going to determine whether it's a chain of events that happens and therefore there's a chiyuv from the very beginning, or something ended, something began? In other words, the pshia, the carelessness ended, and therefore you can't hold them liable. Now he dies, and again, it could be a human, it could be an animal. If the animal dies a what quote unquote is a natural death, can you connect the dots and say that's not so natural because something happened the day before which allowed this to continue? That's a bias.
The pshia really have an effect that will show up later or not?
Right. And that's what.
Yeah, that's the machlokus there.
And that's the machlokus. Abaye is saying
you can't determine it. You don't know for sure.
You don't know for sure. Exactly right. Because you don't know if the agam will have an effect a week later.
Yeah.
That animal will have breathed bad air, and now it dies a natural death because why? Because it breathed bad air a week ago.
Or extreme, it's all the butterfly's fault. The butterfly in Brazil that started the hurricane also killed the cow.
That's right. So, but again, you see how fine-tuned this machlokes is that the Gemara is really drilling down on this to tell us that because we have a klal that chilasa b'pshia v'soita ba'oines, Abaye says chayiv, Rava says potter. Why does Rava say potter? And why does Abaye say chayiv? So that's what we're trying to determine here, because the rest of the Gemara that we'll pick up next week really it goes into great detail based on this machlokes as to how we extrapolate. In fact, I thought we might have a chance today, but we don't, because there's a Gemara a couple of blocks later on. There's a fascinating Gemara which Rashi brings down. We'll have to wait the next week, and Rashi gives us an explanation of that Gemara, which I wanted to spend some time on. So we'll do that next week. But basically, what we're left with right now is the machlokes between Abaye and Rava as to whether or not chilasa b'pshia v'soita ba'oines, you connect the dots to the pshia, or you say no, that there was a clear break and the pshia is over, and now it died of a natural cause of oines. According to Rava, it's always oines, but you see how passionate they were, that each one said that if you don't hold like me, you're not a legitimate dayan. That to me is a fascinating statement, is that they felt so strongly is that if you didn't hold like me, you're not a dayan.
I wouldn't want to be in that room when this machlokes.
With this machlokes, but you see how strong the machlokes is between Abaye and Rava as to whether or not there was any wiggle room at all. According to Abaye, there's no wiggle room, and according to Rava, there's no wiggle room. Each one has a very strong view of its own feeling. All right, so we'll stop here. But again, we have this chazara now. So now, when we next week, Mitchell will pick up. It will relate back to what we started talking about in the very beginning of the machlokes, the discussion between Rav Ami and what he brought down, and the kasha that Abba Bar Mamel raised with him. So Mitchell, next week we'll pick up from here. Lamed Vava Medeis.
Sure.